The gleaming spires of the Galactic Medical Academy rose high into the purple sky, their crystalline surfaces reflecting the light of 3 moons. Inside one of its many lecture halls, nervous whispers spread among the alien students as they waited for their new emergency medicine instructor to arrive. "I heard they hired a Dithworlder," muttered Blue, a jellyfish-like student floating in his gravity-controlled pod. His translucent tentacles rippled with anxiety as he spoke to his classmate. Rock, a silicon-based being with a carefully carved surface that served as their face, turned slightly. "A human. Are they trying to frighten us to death before we even start learning?" The chamber, designed to accommodate students from over 50 different species, was filled with beings of all shapes and sizes. Some floated in special atmosphere bubbles, others sat in reinforced chairs, while a few simply existed as energy patterns in containment fields. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Dr. Smith walked in, and the room fell silent. The human looked surprisingly ordinary for a Deathworlder. Standing at average human height, wearing the standard white medical uniform, Dr. Smith carried a large display tablet and moved with careful, measured steps. "Good morning, class." The doctor's voice was calm and professional. "I'm Dr. Smith, your new emergency medicine instructor. Yes, I'm human. Yes, I'm from Earth. And yes, I'm here to teach you how to save lives." A student made of pure light timid slightly before raising what appeared to be an appendage. "Doctor, we've heard stories about human medical practices." Dr. Smith nodded, setting down the tablet. "I'm sure you have. Let me guess. Brutal, aggressive, dangerous." The human's smile was gentle. "What you call brutal, we call efficient. What you see as aggressive, we know as necessary. And dangerous. Sometimes we must act quickly to prevent even greater danger." The doctor pressed a button, and a holographic display filled the center of the room. It showed various alien anatomies, each highlighted with different colors representing medical priority zones. "Each of you comes from a world that shaped your species. Some of you evolved in low gravity, others in high pressure, some in pure energy states. But all of you can be hurt, and all of you can be helped." Dr. Smith's eyes scanned the room. "My job is to teach you emergency medicine that works across species barriers." Blue's tentacles wavered. "But doctor, human methods, they involve touching patients directly. Many species consider that traumatic." "Excellent point." Dr. Smith picked up a medical scanner. "And that's why we start with understanding. Week 1 isn't about treatment. It's about learning each other. You'll study not just anatomy and physiology, but cultural barriers to treatment. Because sometimes the biggest obstacle to saving a life isn't the injury, it's the hesitation to help." As the lecture continued, the tension in the room gradually eased. The students watched as Dr. Smith demonstrated the use of various non-invasive scanning tools, explaining how they could be used to assess patients of different species without causing distress. "Remember," Dr. Smith said as the first class neared its end, "emergency medicine isn't about what makes us comfortable. It's about what keeps the patient alive. Sometimes that means working outside our comfort zones. All of us." The doctor looked at each student in turn. "By the end of this course, you won't just know how to treat injuries. You'll understand why different approaches work for different species. And yes, some of those approaches might seem shocking at first. But I promise you this. Everything I teach you has been tested, proven, and refined through years of multi-species medical practice." As the students filed out after class, their earlier fear had been replaced by curiosity. Even Blue's tentacles had stopped their nervous flickering. "Maybe," Rock whispered to their classmates, "having a Deathworlder teacher won't be so bad after all." Little did they know that their first real test would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would challenge everything they thought they knew about medical treatment across the galaxy. 3 weeks into the semester, the emergency medicine class had settled into a comfortable routine. Dr. Smith was demonstrating proper scanning techniques on various species when the accident happened. Crystal, a tall crystalline being whose body resembled fine purple quartz, volunteered to help with the day's practical exercise. As they stepped onto the raised platform, their foot slipped on the smooth surface. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Crystal's body, weighing nearly 400 pounds due to their dense mineral structure, crashed onto the hard floor. The sound was terrible, like breaking glass mixed with a deep boom. Fragments of their lower body scattered across the floor, and a large crack ran up their torso. The class erupted in panic. Blue's gravity pod shot up to the ceiling in shock. Rock froze completely, their surface patterns turning a pale gray. Other students began shouting in various languages, their universal translators struggling to keep up with the chaos. "Everyone stay calm." Dr. Smith's voice cut through the noise like a laser. The human was already moving, covering the distance to Crystal in 3 quick strides. The speed of movement made several students flinch. They'd never seen a human move at full speed before. "Blue, lower your pod and call the medical bay." "Rock, activate the emergency containment field." "Everyone else, clear the area." Dr. Smith's commands were sharp and clear. Crystal's voice came out as a weak chiming sound. Their mineral body was designed to handle pressure from all sides equally. A fall like this was catastrophic for their species. Small fragments continued to break off from the main crack. Dr. Smith pulled out a handheld mineral analyzer, scanning Crystal's body quickly. Major structural damage, spreading crack pattern, internal lattice disruption. The human's voice was steady, professional. "Crystal, I need to stabilize you immediately. This will involve direct physical contact. Do you understand?" A faint chime of agreement sounded. What happened next made several students emit sounds of distress. Dr. Smith pulled out a specialized tool from their medical kit, one designed specifically for crystalline life forms. With precise movements that seemed impossibly fast to the watching aliens, the human began to apply a stabilizing compound directly to Crystal's cracked surface. "Those movements, they're so violent," gasped an energy form student, their pattern flickering with anxiety. But Dr. Smith didn't slow down. The human's hands moved with surgical precision, applying pressure at specific points to prevent the cracks from spreading further. Each touch was calculated, though to the watching students it looked terrifyingly aggressive. Stabilizing compound applied. Now for the emergency lattice support. Dr. Smith pulled out what looked like a web of fine metal strands. "This will hurt, but it will prevent further structural damage." The next few minutes were intense. Dr. Smith worked quickly, placing the lattice support around Crystal's damaged areas. The human's movements were direct and forceful, necessary for working with a dense mineral structure, but shocking to watch for species used to much gentler medical approaches. Just as Dr. Smith finished securing the last support, the medical bay team arrived. They stopped in the doorway, surprised to find the situation already under control. "Patient stabilized," Dr. Smith reported, stepping back. "Major structural damage contained, internal lattice secured. They'll need specialized reconstruction, but they're out of immediate danger." Crystal's voice chimed again, stronger this time. "The pain, it's less." "How?" The medical team quickly took over, carefully transferring Crystal to a specialized transport pod. As they left, the class remained in stunned silence. Dr. Smith turned to face the students, hands still covered in stabilizing compound. "This is why we learn emergency medicine. Sometimes you have seconds to act, and gentle methods aren't enough. What looks violent to you may be exactly what's needed to save a life." The class stared at their instructor with new eyes. They had just witnessed something that went against everything they believed about medical treatment, and it had worked. The day after Crystal's accident, the emergency medicine classroom was buzzing with nervous energy. Students clustered in small groups, talking in hushed tones. The empty seat where Crystal usually sat seemed to draw everyone's attention. "I still can't believe what I saw." Blue's tentacles waved in agitation as he spoke to his classmates. The way the human just grabbed and touched without hesitation. On my world, such direct contact would be considered assault. Rock had spent the night processing what they'd witnessed, but Crystal survived. More than survived. The medical bay reports say they're already stabilizing. The door opened, and Dr. Smith walked in. The human carried a large data crystal in one hand and a medical kit in the other. The class fell silent immediately. Yesterday, Dr. Smith began, placing the items on the desk, you witnessed what many would call aggressive emergency treatment. Today, we're going to analyze exactly what happened and why those methods were necessary. The holographic projector activated, showing a detailed replay of the incident. Several students flinched as they watched the fall again. Let's break this down. Dr. Smith pointed to the crack patterns forming on Crystal's body. In a crystalline life form, structural damage spreads at 3.7 meters per second. Traditional gentle treatment protocols take approximately 15 seconds to initiate. By that time, the human paused, letting the implications sink in. Crystal would have shattered completely, whispered a gaseous student from their containment bubble. Exactly. Dr. Smith nodded. What you saw is violent. The immediate application of stabilizing compound, the rapid installation of support lattice, was precisely calculated to match the speed of damage progression. The doctor pulled up another hologram, this one showing Crystal's current status in the medical bay. The difference was striking. The crack patterns were already showing signs of natural reformation. But the touching. Blue couldn't contain himself. Surely there was a way to help without such physical methods. Dr. Smith's expression was understanding but firm. Let me show you something. The human pulled up comparison data from previous crystalline species accidents. These cases used traditional, non-contact methods. Patient survival rate, 47%. With direct intervention methods, a new chart appeared, 93% survival rate. The numbers hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Medicine isn't about what makes us comfortable, Dr. Smith continued. It's about what saves lives. Yes, my methods look shocking to you. They seem violent, aggressive, even frightening. But in emergency medicine, seconds matter. Hesitation kills. A light-form student raised an appendage. Do humans always treat patients this way? No, Dr. Smith smiled. We adapt our methods to each species and situation. Sometimes gentle is best. Sometimes we need to be more direct. The key is knowing the difference. The human walked around the room, making eye contact with each student. Yesterday, you saw what you thought was violence. What you actually saw was precisely controlled force, applied exactly where and when it was needed. Dr. Smith pulled out several practice crystals from the medical kit. Today, we're going to learn exactly how and why those techniques work. By the end of this class, each of you will understand how to recognize when immediate intervention is necessary and how to overcome your cultural hesitations to provide it. The students looked at the practice crystals with a mixture of fear and fascination. Remember, Dr. Smith said, distributing the crystals, your future patients won't care about your cultural comfort zones. They'll care about surviving. Our job is to make sure they do, even if that means pushing past our own preconceptions about what medical treatment should look like. As the class began their practical exercise, there was a new atmosphere in the room. Fear was giving way to curiosity, and shock was transforming into determination. They were beginning to understand that sometimes what looked like violence from the outside was actually the highest form of care. The academy boardroom buzzed with tension as 12 instructors from different species gathered for an emergency meeting. At the center of the discussion was Dr. Smith's emergency treatment of Crystal and the ripples it had caused through the institution. Completely unacceptable. Professor Mist, a gaseous being, swirled angrily in their containment field. We cannot allow such aggressive techniques to be taught to impressionable students. What next? Human-style surgery with actual cutting tools. Dr. Smith sat calmly at the table, surrounded by increasingly agitated alien colleagues. On the large screen behind them, footage of Crystal's treatment played on loop. Professor Light, made entirely of coherent photons, flickered in disagreement. But the results speak for themselves. Crystal's recovery rate is unprecedented. They're already showing signs of natural reformation. At what cost? Demanded Professor Mist. We've had 3 students request transfers out of the emergency medicine class. They say they're traumatized by what they witnessed. Dr. Smith finally spoke, voice steady. And how traumatized would they be if they watched a patient die because they were too afraid to act quickly? The room fell silent. Look at these numbers. Dr. Smith brought up a new display showing emergency treatment statistics from across the galaxy. Traditional gentle methods have their place, but in true emergencies, they often take too long. Every species has a critical response window, the time between injury and death. Humans learn to work within that window, no matter how uncomfortable it looks. Professor Solid, a silicon-based life form like rock, shifted their crystalline structure thoughtfully. But surely there must be a middle ground. Our traditional methods have served us for centuries, and they work perfectly well for planned procedures, Dr. Smith agreed. But emergencies are different. When Crystal fell, they had less than 30 seconds before the crack patterns would have reached their core matrix. Traditional methods would have taken 2 minutes to implement. The human stood up and walked to the display, pointing to specific data points. Look at the survival rates. Planets that have adopted rapid response protocols, even modified ones, show a 40% increase in emergency survival rates across all species. Professor Wave, an energy being who had been quiet until now, pulsed softly. Perhaps we're letting our cultural biases cloud our judgment. The purpose of medicine is to save lives, is it not? Exactly, Dr. Smith said. I'm not suggesting we abandon traditional methods. I'm proposing we expand our definition of acceptable treatment based on the situation. Emergency medicine needs different protocols than routine care. Professor Mist's form had settled somewhat. But the students are here to learn how to save lives, Dr. Smith finished. Yes, some of my methods look aggressive to non-human species, but every technique I teach has been tested, modified, and proven effective for each specific species type. The human pulled up one final display, Crystal's current medical readings. The improvement was undeniable. I propose this, Dr. Smith continued. Let me develop a graduated program. We'll start with traditional methods, then slowly introduce rapid response techniques as students become comfortable. They'll learn when each approach is appropriate and how to overcome their instinctive reactions when quick action is needed. Professor Light brightened slightly. A compromise. Not a compromise. An integration, Dr. Smith corrected. The best of both approaches, used appropriately for each situation. The board members looked at each other. Slowly, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. We will need to establish clear guidelines, Professor Solid said, and safety protocols. Of course, Dr. Smith agreed. We can work together to develop them. After all, isn't that what the Academy is about? Combining different perspectives to create better medical care for everyone. As the meeting continued, the initial hostility gradually transformed into cautious curiosity. Even Professor Mist had stopped swirling agitatedly. Sometimes, they were beginning to realize progress required pushing past comfortable traditions. 2 weeks after the faculty meeting, Crystal made their first return to the emergency medicine class. Their crystalline bodies sparkled with new growth, the former crack lines now transformed into elegant patterns that caught the light. The entire class fell silent as they entered. Welcome back, Dr. Smith said warmly. Would you like to share your experience with the class? Crystal moved to the front of the room, their restored structure moving smoothly. When I fell, they began, their voice chiming clearly. I was certain I would shatter completely. On my homeworld, such accidents are usually fatal. Blue's tentacles waved gently in sympathy, while Rock's surface patterns shifted to show attention. The traditional treatment for my species involves slow, careful applications of stabilizing fields. By the time they're normally set up, Crystal's voice trembled slightly. Well, there usually isn't much left to save. Dr. Smith stood quietly beside them, letting Crystal tell their story. What the doctor did, yes, it seemed violent. Yes, it went against everything my species believes about medical treatment. But I felt the cracks stopping almost immediately. Crystal turned, showing the beautiful patterns where the breaks had been. These lines, they're not scars. They're growth patterns. My body had time to heal properly because it was stabilized so quickly. The class murmured in amazement. An energy form student raised an appendage. But wasn't the physical contact traumatic? Crystal's crystalline surface sparkled with what seemed like amusement. Less traumatic than shattering would have been. I've reviewed the sensor logs from that day. Dr. Smith's movements, which looked so aggressive to everyone, were precisely calculated for my mineral structure. Dr. Smith stepped forward. This brings us to today's lesson. Medicine isn't one size fits all. What looks violent to one species might be exactly what another needs. The human activated the classroom's holographic display, showing detailed scans of various species. Look at these physiological differences. Gas-based life forms need gentle containment. Energy beings require careful field modulation. Crystalline forms, like crystal, sometimes need direct physical intervention. Blue raised a tentacle. But how do we know which approach to use? That's exactly what we're going to learn. Dr. Smith smiled. Crystal has agreed to help demonstrate proper emergency techniques for crystalline life forms. Then we'll cover emergency protocols for each major species type. Crystal moved to the demonstration area. I used to think, like many of you, that quick, direct action was dangerous. That the old, slow ways were always better. Now I understand. Sometimes you need both. The next hour was eye-opening for the class. Crystal and Dr. Smith showed how different techniques could work together. Traditional stabilizing fields combined with rapid physical intervention when needed. The students watched, fascinated, as they began to understand the logic behind each approach. The key, Dr. Smith explained, is knowing your patient's biology and critical response window. Some species can wait for gentle treatment. Others need immediate action. Your job is to know the difference. By the end of the class, something had shifted in the room. The students were looking at their medical kits differently, beginning to see them not as tools of violence or gentleness, but as instruments of survival. Next week, Dr. Smith announced, we'll start practical training. Each of you will learn emergency techniques adapted for different species. Yes, some of them might seem aggressive. Yes, some might make you uncomfortable. But remember Crystal's experience. Sometimes the fastest way to help is not the most comfortable way. As the students filed out, Crystal lingered behind. Doctor, they chimed softly. Thank you. Not just for saving me, but for helping others understand. Dr. Smith nodded. Understanding is the first step to acceptance, and acceptance leads to better medicine for everyone. 1 month after Crystal's return to class, the emergency medicine lab had transformed. Gone were the rigid separations between different species' medical equipment. Instead, the room featured integrated stations where traditional and human emergency techniques stood side by side. Today's scenario, Dr. Smith announced, involves a mixed species accident. You'll need to treat 3 patients simultaneously. A gaseous being with containment breach, a crystalline form with structural damage, and an energy being with pattern disruption. The class, now divided into mixed species response teams, looked at their equipment with new confidence. Blue, Rock, and an energy student named Spark formed one team, their different anatomies no longer a barrier but an advantage. Begin simulation, Dr. Smith commanded. A holographic emergency scene sprang to life. 3 injured patients appeared, each requiring immediate attention. The teams moved into action, their movements showing none of their former hesitation. Blue's tentacles worked the gentle containment fields for the gaseous patient, while simultaneously guiding Rock on proper crystal stabilization techniques. Careful with the pressure. They called out. Remember Crystal's case. Firm but precise. Rock, no longer afraid of direct intervention, applied the stabilizing compound with steady movements. Containment field at 60%, they reported to Blue. Crystal structure responding. Spark, their energy form flickering with concentration, modulated their own frequency to help stabilize the injured energy being. Pattern stabilization initiated. Dr. Smith, is this the correct wavelength? The human moved between teams, offering guidance and corrections. Excellent adaptation. Spark. Blue, your field modulation is perfect. You've found the balance between gentle and quick. Rock, remember what Crystal taught us about pressure points. The practice session continued, with each team showing increasing skill at combining different medical approaches. What once seemed like conflicting methods now worked in harmony. During the break, Professor Light appeared to observe, the photonic being watched in amazement as students from traditionally opposed medical backgrounds worked together seamlessly. Remarkable, they commented to Dr. Smith, a gas-form student using modified human techniques, while a crystalline being applies traditional energy stabilization. I never thought I'd see such integration. Dr. Smith smiled. The key was helping them understand that different approaches aren't right or wrong. They're just tools. The real skill is knowing which tool to use when. The next simulation was even more challenging. A spacecraft crash scenario with multiple injuries across species types. The teams dove in without hesitation. Critical fracture, called out Rock, facing a scenario similar to Crystal's accident. Instead of freezing, they immediately applied direct stabilization, while Blue set up supplementary containment fields. Energy pattern destabilizing. Spark announced, their form brightening with urgency. They quickly established a resonance field while guiding a crystalline student through proper energy modulation techniques. Dr. Smith watched with pride as the students combined quick, direct intervention with careful traditional approaches. Each team found their own balance, adapting techniques to suit different situations and species. Remember, the human called out, speed doesn't always mean aggressive action. Sometimes the fastest response is the gentlest. Trust your training to know the difference. By the end of the session, the success rates in their simulations had reached new highs. The students gathered around the results display, their different forms mixing freely as they discussed their performances. I never thought I'd say this. Blue's tentacles waved excitedly, but those human emergency techniques really work, especially when combined with our traditional methods. Rock's surface patterns showed agreement. It's not about choosing one approach over another. It's about having all the tools available and knowing when to use each one. Dr. Smith listened to their discussions with satisfaction. The integration was working better than anyone had expected, but the real test would come soon enough. Emergencies, after all, didn't announce themselves in advance. One academic cycle later, the Galactic Medical Academy's main auditorium was packed with students and faculty from across the galaxy. The occasion, the launch of the new Emergency Response, Multi-Species Approach Program. At the center of the stage stood Dr. Smith, alongside Crystal, who now wore the insignia of a guest lecturer. When I first arrived here, Dr. Smith began, addressing the crowded room. Many thought human emergency medical techniques were too aggressive, too dangerous to teach. Today, we celebrate the success of combining approaches that once seemed incompatible. The holographic display behind them showed statistics from the past cycle. Emergency survival rates up by 45%, recovery times decreased by 30%, and student confidence levels at an all-time high. Crystal stepped forward, their crystalline form catching the light beautifully. The patterns from their old injury had become a badge of honor, studied by medical students as an example of successful emergency intervention. I stand before you as living proof. Crystal's voice chimed clearly through the auditorium. What once would have been a fatal accident became instead a turning point in galactic medicine. But more importantly, it showed us that different doesn't mean wrong. In the audience, Blue and Rock sat with their old classmates, now qualified emergency medical practitioners. Blue's tentacles moved gracefully as they operated recording equipment, documenting this historic moment for future students. The new program, Dr. Smith continued, will teach emergency medicine as it should be taught, without bias, without fear, and without limiting ourselves to any single approach. Professor Mist, once the strongest opponent of human medical techniques, floated forward. "I was wrong," they announced, their gaseous forms swirling calmly. "I thought we had to choose between gentle traditional methods and quick human interventions. Instead, we learned to use both, each in its proper time and place." The screen changed to show recordings from recent emergency responses. Teams of mixed species worked together seamlessly, energy beings providing power to medical equipment, crystalline forms offering structural support, gaseous beings creating protective atmospheres, while others performed direct interventions when needed. But perhaps, Crystal chimed in, the most important lesson wasn't medical at all. It was learning to see past our preconceptions. What looks like violence to one species might be care to another. What seems gentle to some might be dangerously slow to others. A student raised their appendage. "But how do we know which approach to use?" Dr. Smith smiled. "That's exactly what we teach now. Not just the techniques, but the wisdom to know when to use them. Every emergency is unique, every patient is different, and every response must be tailored to the situation." The screen showed another set of statistics. The number of medical academies across the galaxy now adopting the integrated approach. The number was growing weekly. "Today," Crystal announced proudly, "I'm not just a survivor. I'm part of the teaching team for the new program. My accident became a gift, a way to show others that sometimes the most frightening approach might be exactly what's needed." The audience erupted in multi-species applause, some clapping, others flashing lights, some vibrating at approving frequencies. "Remember," Dr. Smith concluded, "what matters isn't how gentle or aggressive a technique appears. What matters is saving lives. And sometimes that means being brave enough to try something new." As the ceremony ended, Dr. Smith watched their former students, now colleagues, demonstrating emergency techniques to the new intake. Blue showing proper field modulation, Rock teaching crystal stabilization, and Crystal explaining how different approaches could work together. The human smiled, remembering the fear and suspicion of that first day. Now, the sight of a human doctor working alongside alien colleagues barely raised an eyebrow, or equivalent sensory organ. "Doctor," Crystal chimed softly, approaching their old instructor, "you've changed galactic medicine forever." "No," Dr. Smith replied, watching the next generation of medical professionals at work. "We all did it together. One emergency, one lesson, one life saved at a time."